So today we're going to be revisiting a topic that you should hopefully be familiar with. We're going to cover the Bleeding Kansas period following the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As you remember from yesterday, of course, the Kansas and Nebraska territories were opened up to settlement, and it was decided that popular sovereignty was going to determine whether or not these territories would come into the Union as free territories or slave territories. And, of course, in principle, this means orderly voting, and in practice, not so much. And the whole thing is, of course, going to culminate in unbelievable amounts of violence and the burning down of Lawrence during the Civil War. So, I know you studied this in middle school, so we're just going to give you a brief sort of overview of the whole Bleeding Kansas crisis. Of course, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up settlement of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, as we see here on this map. They were open to slavery despite the fact that they were north of the 3630 line established in the Missouri Compromise. This was somewhat to counterbalance, of course, the admission of California, and partially because the Whig Party dissolving left the Democrats in charge and they were much more sort of open to slavery. So what you end up getting is Kansas was relatively fertile, at least in the sort of eastern parts. And so settlers start flooding in of all different ideologies. And this is, of course, going to lead to conflict because, of course, while some people were coming to Kansas simply to take advantage of the available land, others are coming to clearly influence the vote and push Kansas either into the pro-slavery or the anti-slavery categories. One of the architects of this flood of settlement was Missouri Senator and later Governor David Atchison, who is going to encourage and organize pro-slavery Missourians to cross the border and settle in Kansas, and also organize massive amounts of voter fraud and voter intimidation and all this other stuff to attempt to ensure that Kansas is a slave state. And of course, with Missouri being right next to Kansas, he's going to have a lot of influence, and it's going to be very easy for Missourians to influence the internal politics of Kansas. So, with this massive flood of settlement, the first constitution in Kansas was written up. This was called the Lecompton Constitution. Here we see Lecompton Constitutional Hall, which you can come visit after the Constitution was written up. And it was a pro-slavery constitution, which was somewhat surprising because there were a lot of abolitionists who had flooded into Kansas as well. And when all the votes were tallied, it turned out that the pro-slavery constitution got more votes than there were registered voters in the entire state, on the entire territory of Kansas. And so this raised some red flags for what I hope were obvious reasons. And there was some debate and some issues about this pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. So, the voter fraud was Missourians coming over, voting multiple times, going to multiple polling places, intimidating free state voters. And so this is going to, of course, organize and really give a lot more steam and a lot more power to the free state cause. And so we start seeing meetings, protests, we start seeing meetings, we start seeing protests, we start seeing people talking about maybe writing up alternative constitutions. And despite the fact that Franklin Pierce pushed Congress to recognize the pro-slavery constitution, there were a lot of people who were pushing back against that. And so this controversy, of course, got all the way to Washington, and it got really heated, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, but it did lead to the assault of at least one senator and some significant tension within the United States Congress itself, as, of course, abolitionists wanted the pro-slavery, clearly fraudulent Constitution thrown out, and pro-slavery Southerners wanted it recognized, arguing that it demonstrated that demonstrated the will of the people, and that popular sovereignty works, of course. So we see here significant debate over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Lecompton Constitution. So opposition to the Lecompton Constitution really sort of centralized in two places. First, the city of Topeka, and second, the city of Lawrence. Both of these were founded, or at least led, by abolitionists. And so we got several other constitutions, one coming from Topeka itself to counter the Lecompton Constitution, And then Leavenworth and Wyandotte both wrote up their own constitutions. And so now Congress had 4 different territorial constitutions for the state of Kansas, 3 of them being anti-slavery and 1 of them being pro-slavery. Especially Lawrence became the especial hotbed of sort of anti-slavery or free soil movements, and specifically the Free State Hotel, which is where the Eldridge Hotel is today, became the center of this sort of movement with meetings being held. They were printing pro-free soil newspapers in the basement, and this became sort of a symbol for the free soil cause, which led to the sack of Lawrence by a pro-slavery mob. The sack of Lawrence isn't as bad as it sounds. When you think of a city being sacked, you think like abject destruction and all that. It was mainly to try to intimidate the citizens of Lawrence, and so this pro-slavery mob, rode their horses in and like threatened a bunch of people, and rode around the streets, making a lot of noise and commotion. But their real target, and the main reason for this, was they were looking to destroy the Free State Hotel, which they ended up doing. And so they burned down the Free State Hotel, and the only fatality in the whole sack of Lawrence was actually one of the pro-slavery mob who was hit by a collapsing wall on the Free State Hotel. And so the only casualty was on the pro-slavery side, but the Free State Hotel was burned to the ground. This got the abolitionist community really mad, and so now we have to enter a guy named John Brown, who you probably are familiar with. But John Brown was an anti-slavery zealot. Here's John Brown in his more calm-looking years. He was a failed businessman from the East, and he had slowly sort of migrated across the country before ending up in Kansas. And he got very wrapped up in this abolitionist cause. He also believed that God was speaking directly to him, and it was his job to sort of solve this slavery problem. So he decided to take matters into his own hands, and here's the John Brown that's painted, the mural that's painted on the State House wall, which you're probably familiar with. And so he decided to take matters into his own hands, which led us to the Potawatomi Massacre, which was John Brown and a free soil militia, including several of his sons, went to a pro-slavery farmer near Potawatomi's house and territory, and they dragged the men out into the front yard and slaughtered them. Brown saw this as sort of righteous retribution for the destruction of Lawrence, despite the fact that no one that was killed or was at that house had anything to do with it. They simply happened to be pro-slavery settlers. And so Brown more or less murdered them in cold blood as an act of domestic terrorism in order to try to intimidate the pro-slavery forces, the same way the sack of Lawrence was supposed to intimidate the anti-slavery forces. And so now more blood is shed, and the whole situation is just going to sort of devolve into chaos, death, and score settling. This is called the Border War, starting just before the Civil War and then continuing throughout the whole Civil War. Groups of armed bushwhackers from Missouri traveled through Kansas, burning towns, villages, and farms, and groups of anti-slavery militias, known as Jayhawkers, crossed the border into Missouri, burning down towns there. And so the Civil War basically happened in miniature in Kansas. Many towns were burned, people were killed, crops were destroyed, and yeah, it was pretty ugly. In Missouri, all of these different places were raided. You can see the battles of the Civil War in Missouri, and most of them being sort of small engagements from irregular forces, considering Missouri was technically a Union state in the Civil War, which we'll get to later. So, tons of violence in Missouri, tons of violence in Lawrence, cities burned, and culminated in Quantrell's raid on Lawrence. William Quantrell was a Confederate aligned sort of cavalry general or commander, and he would end up burning the city of Lawrence to the ground and killing several hundred people. And so that's Bleeding Kansas. It's the sort of Civil War in miniature in Kansas, and it's the repudiation of the platform of popular sovereignty, because it demonstrates the clear gap in the logic here, is the idea that people with an issue as polarizing as slavery, people could just show up politely and vote one way or the other. Obviously, that's not going to happen. So we'll look at how the rest of the country sort of falls apart in the same way in our next lecture. But for right now, this is just a brief overview of Bleeding Kansas, and it's relevant to us, of course, as Kansans, much more so than it would be to the rest of the country.